So let's start with today's short lecture. So basically we'll cover four things today. The first thing is what is ideology, and the second is going to be the purpose, the goal of the ideology. Why do we have the ideology? And then we'll look at the left and right, what they mean, and also the ideological spectrum, maybe spectrums. And then finally we'll look at very shortly the classical ideologies, basically liberalism, conservatism, socialism, and maybe a little bit nationalism. So let's start with the definition of ideology. So there are so many different ways to define it. In this week's reading, you'll see Karl Popper and Marxist definitions of the ideology. This is why I prefer to give you another version of the ideology. This is much more common sense version of it. So basically, when we talk about the ideology in its broadest sense, we are talking about a plan of vision to improve the society. So basically, this is very relative, as you can guess. This is very subjective because improving society can change from person to person. So it can be different from person to person, and then different for groups. So when you think about it, ideology can actually mean different things, or improving society can mean different things for different groups. So and another important thing that we have to keep in mind is, even though ideologies are written documents most of the time, like based on theories, for instance, when we talk about liberalism, we have to give reference to Adam Smith, a very important English economist. He wrote a very famous book, The Wealth of Nations. And he's kind of like the founding father of the whole idea of free market economy. And you definitely have to give reference to it. But true believers of liberalism, for instance, they might actually tell you that the pure understanding of liberalism in terms of Adam Smith's writing actually has never experienced in the real world. In other words, ideologies almost never work out precisely as intended. You can always make the same argument for Marxism. Even though we have the Soviet experience, so many Marxists might tell you that actually the Soviet experience was so different from the original Marxist ideology. So, second, why do we have ideologies? What's the purpose of the ideology? And I think we can classify under four headings. So first of all, ideologies provide cues or information to people. So for instance, think about an average American, right? This person probably works 8 to 10 hours a day. And then this person might have a family, kids, and this person might not necessarily find enough time to be interested in politics. But at the same time, even though we don't necessarily spend too much thinking about politics, we already have some beliefs about how society should look like, right? But the ideology can help this kind of an average American, that can actually, ideology can provide some shortcuts so that actually this person does not necessarily need to read too much on issues, for instance. This is why actually we'll also talk about this when during the week we'll talk about political parties, and political parties and ideologies always go hand in hand. We'll also come to that as well. So this is number one. It provides cue for the people to follow politics. Second one is they promise a better world to people. So it's kind of a utopia, right? So I think the utopian Marxism, for instance, or scientific Marxism, as some of other people might call it. So this kind of provides and promises a worldview in which actually there is a classless society, right? So there is no state, there is no private property. But as you all know, in almost none of the communist systems, these things actually get accomplished. So, but at least people have something to believe in if they get into an ideology, and especially in terms of improving the society. And third, the values and ideas of ideologies give people something to believe in. So ideology is very, very related to having a belief. It's almost like kind of a religious system. This is why ideologies are also described as closed thoughts or doctrines. So basically, another important purpose of the ideology, it gives people something to believe. So these two things are quite related with each other. I said 2 and 3, but you can actually take it as one. So another one is ideology make it easier for politicians and political parties to differentiate themselves from others. So why is it important? It's important because if people do not have relevant choices in front of them, they actually do not want to participate in politics as much. So this is why, for instance, in 1960s and 70s, political parties in the US got criticized so much because there was almost no difference between them. So they have to differentiate themselves, and ideologies give them the easy way to differentiate themselves from each other. And finally, ideologies hold people together. So this is also quite important goal or the mechanism of the ideology. And it also holds parties together. So it holds things together in politics. So now I'm going to move to the left and right. We know them as liberal and conservative in this country, but worldwide, people do not necessarily use liberal and conservative. They prefer to call left and right. And we can definitely discuss about the differences in tomorrow's synchronous meeting. But generally, historically, first of all, the source of the left and right, the whole idea is actually coming from the French Revolution. So after French Revolution happened in the French National Assembly, the very first French National Assembly, the pro-monarchists were sitting on the right side and the revolutionary Republicans were sitting on the left side. So this is why we have this kind of conceptualization of different positions in politics. So generally speaking, the right represents kind of a resistance against change, political, economic, and social change. So on the other hand, left is much more associated with the change itself. So it's kind of identified with republicanism sometimes, or anti-clericalism, or the interest of the masses. But doesn't have to be that way sometimes, because ideologies are also not steady. They can change. They are very dynamic things, and we can definitely discuss about this tomorrow as well. So if we have right and left, right, we are talking about a spectrum, a dimension here. So then, of course, it's possible to talk about center of that dimension and the edges of that dimension. So this is also quite important to consider. So when we look at the center today, center is committed to the existing constitutional system. So, but of course, center also accepts the legitimacy of gradual social and economic change. So if you look from this perspective, I think we can all agree that actually center is more right. Even though you say that I'm left of the center or center left. Center left is going to be classified as conservative to the other groups, compared to other groups who are asking for bigger change or more sudden change, like revolutionary change. So there are different ways to study ideology in political science. Since we are talking about left and right, you can actually place yourself as human being on this ideological spectrum. Actually, as political scientists, that's what we do in public opinion research. So we ask people in surveys where to place themselves on the ideological spectrum. And this week's assignment is directly about that, actually. I will assign you taking a short ideological test, and then I'm going to ask you to write a reflection, a blog, actually, about your own ideology. But then, of course, it's beyond individuals. There are also political parties, individual politicians, and also social movements. They can also be analyzed by their ideology. So political parties at the center of the ideological spectrum, then there are parties moving towards the edges of that spectrum. So radical left, radical right. We can all discuss about what they represent maybe during tomorrow's discussion. So there are also different ways to different ways to characterize the ideological spectrum. So one way is looking just at the economics. So basically, when we look at the economics, I think this is a perfect point to start talking about liberalism. So the whole idea of liberalism, the birth of liberalism, actually starts with Adam Smith. So it's basically about how nations grow, economically grow. That was the main puzzle for Adam Smith at that time. And the reason why he came up with the idea of laissez-faire or laissez-passer, these are two very important principles of classical liberalism. So basically, the whole idea was about governments or states should not intervene. They should necessarily not take serious roles in economics, because otherwise, according to Adam Smith, free markets can actually stop working as they are planned to work. So this is a very important belief in classical liberalism. So the whole idea is actually markets regulate themselves. There is no need for the government regulation. But then, of course, there is another version of liberalism, which is called modern liberalism, because as time has passed, people or societies in the West especially realize that markets, when they are not regulated, do not necessarily function as Adam Smith theorized them as function. So basically, they started to observe their monopolies, and there's big income inequality. So then modern liberalism, especially in the US context, people who place themselves on the left side of the spectrum, they come with this understanding of internationalism, civil rights, increased government intervention, especially spending for social welfare. So these are the things that differentiate modern liberals from classical liberals. And then there is conservatism. So conservatism is maybe kind of an attitude more than a doctrine. So it's maybe more about people's attitudes. But of course, there is a big chunk of literature behind conservatism. And I think some things that you can think about when you start thinking about conservatism, they first of all accept free market economy, but when it comes to social issues, they more focus on law and order, and then they are more nationalist and support for family values. These are things that you can think of when you think about conservatism and classical conservatism. But then there are also other movements or ideologies that get more radical over time, such as Thatcherism. So the name comes from very famous English British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. So basically, in this kind of an understanding, it always comes in its own context, right? So when towards the end of 1970s, the capitalist economies in the West got into crisis and after crisis, and these people like Margaret Thatcher or Ronald Reagan in the US context, there are also economists like Hayek and Milton Friedman. So they come up with the idea that the welfare states are actually killing the capitalist growth. So this is why they say this welfare state should be either removed or they should be diminished. So this is the whole idea of the Thatcherism or conservatism in that sense. But this is kind of a marriage between conservatism and neoliberalism. So in the economic sense, they were quite liberal, but on the social aspects, they are very, very conservative. So then, of course, we have to talk about social democracy. So socialism, according to liberals or even conservatives, might be placed on the right because of the premises it has about the government intervention or state intervention in economics. So basically, the whole idea is the capitalism creates a high inequality in the society, and it creates a lot of injustice in the society. And in order to avoid that, according to socialists, states should get involved and they have to regulate markets.